Cranially to the frontal are the nasal bones. These are flat, large bones which end in a characteristic pit. Cranially to the frontal are the nasal bones. These are flat, large bones which end in a characteristic pit. Ventrally to the nasal bones are the two incisives. These two bones articulate in the middle but leave space for the interincisive foramen, which allows the passage of the interincisive vessels. The incisive bone has a big nasal process, projected caudally towards the nasal bone. Between the nasal and incisive bones, it is the naso-incisive notch, which is covered by skin and thin muscles, and is therefore easily palpable in the live horse. Cranially to the orbit is the lacrimal bone. This bone has two aspects, the facial and the orbital aspect. The main features of this small bone are better displayed in an isolated specimen. In the orbital aspect there is the lacrimal fossa, which is the entry of the lacrimal canal, responsible for drawing the tears from the conjunctival sac to the nasal vestibule. Ventrally to the lacrimal is the zygomatic bone. It also has facial and lacrimal aspects. The most relevant feature of this bone is the caudally projected zygomatic process, which builds the cranial part of the zygomatic arch. The maxillary bone is the biggest bone in the skull. There are several important landmarks in this bone. Ventrally is the alveolar process, the place where the molar and premolar teeth are placed. In the lateral aspect of the maxillary bone there is a big foramen. This is the infraorbital foramen, which is the end of the infraorbital canal, the place where the sensitive infraorbital nerve has its way towards the upper lip and nostrils. Another feature in the maxillary is the facial crest. This crest is the place where the masseter muscle originates and is palpable in the live horse. In a medial position is the palatine process, which together with the corresponding palatine process of the incisive bone build most of the bony basis of the hard palate. Finally, caudally in the maxillary is the maxillary tuberosity. Related with the most caudal part of the hard palate is the palatine bone. Whereas its horizontal plate joins the bony palate, its perpendicular plate projects caudally towards the pterygoid process. The smallest bone in the skull is the pterygoid. This bone runs medially over the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. At the tip, the pterygoid bone has the hamillus, which has a groove for the passage of the tendon of the tensor of the soft palate muscle. Three more bones should be considered in the skull: the vomer, the ethmoid, and the ventral nasal turbinate. All three of them are related with the nasal cavity. Ventrally, it is the vomer, which comes from the ventral surface of the cranium to the floor of the nasal cavity. This bone supports the cartilaginous of the nasal septum. Caudally in the nasal cavity is the ethmoid. Part of this bone, the so-called lamina cribosa, wields the cranial limit of the cranium. A second part of the ethmoid is the perpendicular plate, which is related with the septum of the nasal cavity. Finally, the ethmoid has a labyrinth of bone turbinates. The turbinates are thin and coiled bones which project rostrally from the bottom of the nasal cavity. Two of those turbinates are much bigger and therefore receive particular names. These are the dorsal nasal turbinate and the middle nasal turbinate. It is important to recall that those turbinates are related with the sense of smell. The last bone in the skull is the ventral nasal turbinate. This bone is very similar to the dorsal nasal turbinate, but as it is not part of the ethmoid, it should be considered as an independent turbinate. It is important to bear in mind that some bones of the skull have paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are air-filled spaces communicated with the nasal cavity and lined with respiratory mucosa. The two most important sinuses in the horse are the maxillary which is hollow in this image, and also the frontal sinuses. In this skull from an aged horse, the wall of the maxillary has been sectioned to demonstrate that most of the maxillary is hollow. There are two maxillary sinuses, which are completely separated by a septum. Therefore, the sinuses are named rostral and caudal maxillary sinuses. The frontal is also a hollow bone. In the horse, the frontal bone joins the sinus of the dorsal nasal turbinate. Thus, in the horse, the frontal sinus should rather be named conchofrontal sinus.